The shelter existed before the fear arrived, but it was fear that gave the space its true weight. Built from reinforced concrete and sunk into the earth, it was meant to be a rational answer to an irrational age, a place where calculations of blast radius and structural tolerance promised a thin margin of safety. Yet once people crowded inside, those technical intentions dissolved. The air grew heavy with breath, damp clothing, and the unspoken awareness that survival was no longer a certainty but a negotiation conducted moment by moment. The walls did not feel protective so much as enclosing, sealing everyone into a shared anticipation that something worse was coming. Time behaved strangely in the shelter. Minutes stretched, then collapsed, losing their ordinary meaning. There were no windows, no natural markers to separate 1 hour from the next, only the distant concussions above ground and the subtle tremors that ran through the floor. Each sound carried interpretation with it. Was this closer than the last, stronger, final? The mind learned to listen obsessively, to convert noise into prediction. In that constant vigilance, exhaustion set in quickly, but rest felt dangerous, almost irresponsible. To relax was to risk being unprepared for pain. The expectation of pain did not arrive suddenly. It accumulated, layer by layer, shaped by stories already lived and those still unfolding outside. Many in the shelter had seen enough to know how fragile the body was, how easily it could be broken by shrapnel, collapse, or simple neglect. They had witnessed neighbors carried away on doors turned into stretchers, streets transformed into debris fields, familiar buildings reduced to outlines against smoke. These memories followed them underground, replaying in the dark whenever silence allowed the mind to wander. Pain was no longer hypothetical, it was a continuation of a pattern. Fear in the shelter was communal but intensely personal. Everyone shared the same space, yet each person carried a private catalog of losses and dreads. Some feared physical injury, imagining the sharp clarity of wounds, the helplessness of being trapped. Others feared separation, children lost in the chaos, loved ones buried elsewhere, unreachable and perhaps already gone. For some, the deeper fear was moral rather than physical, the dread of what prolonged terror might turn them into, how desperation could erode decency, how survival itself might demand compromises they were not sure they could live with. The shelter enforced proximity, stripping away the usual boundaries that allowed people to manage their emotions in private. Strangers sat shoulder to shoulder, close enough to feel each other's trembling, to hear whispered prayers and suppressed sobs. There was no room to fully grieve or fully panic. Everything had to be moderated, contained, because there was nowhere for excess emotion to go. In this compressed environment, anticipation became the dominant emotional state, a sustained readiness for harm that never quite arrived but never fully receded either. Silence, when it came, was not comforting. It suggested a pause rather than an end, a breath drawn before the next blow. People listened to it as intently as they listened to noise, aware that quiet could be deceptive. In that silence, thoughts grew louder. The mind rehearsed scenarios endlessly, preparing for injury, for loss, for the moment when the shelter might fail. This rehearsal was not a choice, it was a reflex. Expecting pain felt safer than being surprised by it. The physical discomfort of the shelter reinforced this psychological state. The cold seeped in through the ground, numbing feet and stiffening joints. The smell of damp earth mixed with sweat and fear, creating an atmosphere that clung to clothing and skin. Hunger gnawed quietly, sharpening irritability and weakening resolve. Every ache, every cramp, every cough felt like a warning sign, as if the body itself were already beginning to break down in anticipation of greater suffering. Children sensed the tension even if they could not articulate it. They watched adult faces closely, learning when to stay silent, when to cling, when to retreat inward. Some cried openly, their fear unfiltered, while others grew unnaturally quiet, absorbing the mood around them with unsettling seriousness. For the adults, these reactions intensified the expectation of pain. Protecting the young felt impossible in a world where even walls were provisional. The war outside the shelter was vast and impersonal, driven by strategies, alliances, and ideologies far removed from individual lives. Inside, however, its effects were intimate and immediate. Every person understood that decisions made elsewhere, by commanders, politicians, distant authorities, had narrowed their world to this underground chamber. That realization fostered a sense of powerlessness that deepened the anticipation of harm. If control had been surrendered so completely, what else might be taken next? Expectation became a kind of armor. By assuming pain was inevitable, people tried to blunt its potential impact. Hope felt risky, almost indulgent, as if allowing it might invite greater disappointment. Optimism was treated with suspicion, not because it was irrational, but because it had proven costly before. Many had hoped earlier in the war, only to see those hopes dismantled by events they could neither predict nor influence. In the shelter, restraint of emotion felt like a survival skill. Yet this emotional discipline carried its own cost. By constantly bracing for pain, people lived it in advance. The body reacted as if injury were already occurring, muscles tense, breath shallow, heart racing. This sustained stress drained energy and blurred the boundary between anticipation and experience. Pain was no longer only something that might happen, it was something already present, diffused through nerves and thoughts. The shelter thus became more than a refuge from bombs. It was a crucible where fear was refined into expectation, where suffering was rehearsed in the absence of immediate injury. The environment taught its occupants to think in terms of endurance rather than outcome. Survival was framed not as escape or victory, but as the ability to withstand whatever came next without collapsing entirely. Within this mindset, morality narrowed. Acts were judged less by their ideals and more by their utility. Sharing food, offering comfort, even speaking too loudly were weighed against the risk of drawing attention or depleting scarce resources. Compassion persisted, but it was cautious, measured. People learned to conserve not just supplies, but emotional energy, saving it for moments they believed would demand it most. The expectation of pain also shaped how people perceived others. Any unfamiliar presence, any sign of authority, was instinctively associated with threat. Uniforms, accents, even certain gestures carried connotations formed by previous encounters and circulating rumors. Trust was not easily extended. It had been eroded by too many reversals. In this environment, neutrality felt safer than engagement, withdrawal safer than connection. As the hours dragged on, the shelter settled into a tense equilibrium. No one spoke of the future in concrete terms. Plans extended only as far as the next moment of silence, the next distant explosion. The war had compressed horizons as effectively as it had compressed space. Life was lived in fragments, each one shaped by the assumption that pain was not just possible, but probable. This was the emotional landscape in which everything else would unfold. Before kindness, before reversal, before any disruption of the expected order, there was this: a community bound together by fear, trained by experience to anticipate harm, and enclosed within walls that protected bodies while leaving minds exposed. The shelter held them, but it did not reassure them. It taught them to wait, not for relief, but for suffering, and in that waiting, it revealed how deeply war could colonize the inner world long before it destroyed the outer one. Beyond the shelter's sealed entrance, the war continued to unfold with a rhythm that felt both relentless and detached. Decisions made far from the city shaped the skies overhead, converting distant negotiations and strategic calculations into immediate physical consequences. Bombers traced invisible paths across the darkness, and artillery answered in kind, each exchange reinforcing the sense that history itself was pressing down on the ground. Inside the shelter, this vast machinery of conflict was reduced to vibrations and sound, but its presence was undeniable. Every tremor served as a reminder that the world outside had been reorganized around destruction. The people underground understood that the war did not recognize them as individuals. It moved according to objectives and timetables that did not account for fear, exhaustion, or moral doubt. This realization deepened the emotional isolation of the shelter. The occupants were no longer participants in events so much as their recipients, absorbing the consequences without influence. The enemy, in this context, was not a single nation or army but the impersonal force of momentum itself, a system that generated suffering as a byproduct of progress toward victory. As the hours passed, expectation hardened into routine. People learned the patterns of bombardment, distinguishing between distant and nearby impacts, between the sounds that signaled danger and those that merely prolonged anxiety. This knowledge did not bring comfort, it brought familiarity. Fear became structured, organized around probabilities rather than chaos. In this way, the shelter functioned as a classroom in endurance, teaching its occupants how to live alongside the constant possibility of harm without being overwhelmed by it. Yet familiarity carried a paradoxical cruelty. As fear became routine, it lost the sharp edge that might have demanded resolution. Instead, it spread out, flattening emotional responses into a steady, draining tension. There were no peaks dramatic enough to justify release, no clear signals that the worst had arrived or passed. The war outside maintained a steady pressure, and inside the shelter, that pressure translated into fatigue so deep it bordered on numbness. People began to measure themselves against this endurance. There was a quiet, unspoken comparison of who could remain composed the longest, who could suppress panic most effectively. Emotional restraint became a form of social currency, admired but rarely acknowledged. To break down was not condemned, but it was feared, because it threatened the fragile balance that allowed everyone else to hold themselves together. In this way, suffering became contagious, something to be managed carefully. The shelter also intensified the sense of moral ambiguity. News filtered in sporadically, often distorted by rumor and fear. Reports of victories and losses blurred together, stripped of context. Without clear narratives, people struggled to assign meaning to what was happening. The war's justifications felt abstract and remote compared to the immediate reality of cramped space and shallow breathing. This disconnect fostered a quiet skepticism, a sense that grand explanations could not fully account for the suffering being endured. Outside, the war demanded loyalty, sacrifice, and certainty. Inside the shelter, certainty was in short supply. People questioned not only the outcome of the conflict, but the assumptions that had led to it. They wondered how the world had arrived at a point where safety was an exception rather than a norm, where entire communities were reduced to waiting underground for forces beyond their control to decide their fate. These questions had no immediate answers, but they lingered, adding intellectual unease to physical fear. The enemy, once clearly defined by uniforms and borders, became increasingly abstract. It was present in the sound of engines overhead, in the dust that drifted down from the ceiling, in the way conversations stalled mid-sentence at every loud noise. It was also present in the erosion of trust, in the instinctive suspicion toward any authority that promised protection. The war had taught people that assurances were fragile, easily broken by events. As resources dwindled, the shelter's social dynamics shifted. Food, water, and space were carefully monitored, and every distribution carried the potential for conflict. People were forced to confront uncomfortable truths about fairness and need. Who deserved more? Who could endure less? These questions, rarely voiced aloud, influenced behavior in subtle ways. Acts of generosity were weighed against self-preservation, and even small decisions carried moral weight. Despite these tensions, there was also a stubborn persistence of order. People cleaned small areas, organized belongings, and established informal routines. These actions were not practical in any strategic sense, but they provided a semblance of control. In a world governed by unpredictable violence, maintaining order within the shelter became a way to resist total surrender to chaos. It was a quiet assertion of humanity against the war's dehumanizing force. The psychological distance between inside and outside continued to grow. For those in the shelter, the world beyond the walls became almost theoretical, defined by sound and imagination rather than sight. Streets, buildings, and landmarks were reconstructed mentally, often in idealized or distorted forms. This mental reconstruction served both as comfort and torment, reminding people of what they had lost access to and what might no longer exist as they remembered it. The longer the shelter remained occupied, the more its temporary nature began to feel permanent. People stopped asking when they would emerge, focusing instead on how long they could remain. This shift in perspective marked a subtle but significant change. Survival was no longer framed as a transition back to normal life, but as an ongoing condition. The war had reshaped expectations not just of safety, but of time itself. In this environment, anticipation of pain coexisted with a quieter, more unsettling fear that nothing would change, that the war's impersonal logic would continue indefinitely, grinding down bodies and spirits without resolution. This fear was harder to articulate, but it manifested in a creeping sense of resignation. Hope, when it appeared, was fleeting and cautious, quickly subdued by reminders of how little control anyone truly had. The shelter thus became a microcosm of the larger conflict. It reflected the war's contradictions: order imposed amid chaos, moral ideals strained by survival, human connection threatened but not extinguished. The people inside were not heroes or villains. They were witnesses, enduring the consequences of decisions made elsewhere. Their experience underscored a fundamental truth of war, that its greatest impact is often felt not in moments of dramatic action, but in prolonged states of waiting, uncertainty, and quiet fear. By the end of this phase, the expectation of pain had merged seamlessly with daily existence. It no longer felt like an extraordinary condition, but like the baseline against which all other emotions were measured. The war outside continued to advance, retreat, and transform, but inside the shelter, the dominant reality was endurance. Pain was anticipated not as a singular event, but as a persistent possibility woven into every breath, every sound, and every thought, shaping lives in ways that would outlast the conflict itself. The shift began so subtly that many did not recognize it at first. After days, perhaps weeks, of living within a framework of fear, any change was difficult to perceive unless it announced itself through violence. The shelter's inhabitants had learned to expect disruption only in the form of danger. When something different arrived, something quieter, restrained, almost tentative, it did not immediately register as meaningful. It passed through the space like a soft draft, felt but not yet understood. The British presence did not come with the theatrical markers people had associated with armies. There was no shouting, no forceful assertion of authority, no immediate demand for obedience. Instead, it entered the edges of awareness through small, practical actions that carried no obvious threat. Supplies were distributed with care rather than indifference. Instructions were given without cruelty. The tone was measured, deliberate, and notably absent of contempt. For people conditioned to associate power with harm, this restraint was disorienting. At first, suspicion dominated the response. Years of war had taught everyone that kindness could be strategic, that gentleness might conceal intent. The shelter's occupants watched closely, parsing every movement for signs of deception. They had learned to read danger in details, to distrust anything that deviated too sharply from expectation. The absence of violence did not immediately feel like safety. It felt like a delay. Yet as time passed, the pattern held. No punishment followed minor infractions. No humiliation accompanied compliance. When needs were addressed, they were addressed evenly, without visible favoritism or cruelty. This consistency began to undermine the narratives people had built to survive. The war had trained them to simplify the world into threats and defenses. What they were witnessing now resisted that simplification. The emotional impact of this restraint was profound precisely because it was understated. There was no moment of collective realization, no sudden release of fear. Instead, individuals experienced private disruptions to their internal logic. Some felt confusion, others discomfort, and a few an almost painful sense of disbelief. The expectation of pain had been so thoroughly internalized that its absence created a vacuum. People were unsure what emotional posture to adopt in response. This uncertainty manifested physically. Bodies that had remained tense for prolonged periods struggled to relax. Muscles twitched involuntarily, as if preparing for blows that never came. Sleep, when it arrived, was shallow and fragmented, haunted by the possibility that calm was temporary. The nervous system, long accustomed to alarm, did not easily accept quiet as genuine. For some, the British kindness stirred memories of a world that had existed before the war imposed its brutal clarity. It recalled interactions governed by civility rather than dominance, by mutual recognition rather than fear. These memories were both comforting and painful. They reminded people of what had been lost and raised the unsettling possibility that it might not be entirely irretrievable. That possibility carried risk, because hope, once revived, could be wounded again. The shelter's social dynamics began to shift in response. Conversations grew marginally less guarded. People spoke a little more freely, though still in subdued tones. There was a cautious reemergence of empathy, expressed through small gestures rather than words. A shared glance, a brief nod, the unspoken acknowledgement that something unexpected was happening. These micro-interactions marked the earliest stages of emotional recalibration. Children, less burdened by entrenched expectations, responded first. They noticed the change in atmosphere before adults allowed themselves to name it. Their bodies relaxed more readily, their attention drifting away from constant vigilance. This shift was both reassuring and alarming to the adults who watched them. Protectiveness intensified, driven by the fear that renewed innocence might be exposed to sudden betrayal. The British individuals involved did not seek recognition for their behavior. There were no speeches, no declarations of moral superiority. Their actions suggested an understanding that trust could not be demanded or hurried. This patience, whether intentional or instinctive, became a critical factor in altering the emotional landscape of the shelter. By not insisting on gratitude or compliance beyond what was necessary, they allowed space for perception to change organically. Still, resistance persisted. Some occupants interpreted the restraint as weakness or manipulation. They had survived long enough to know that appearances could deceive, that war rewarded caution more often than openness. For them, withholding trust was not hostility but self-defense. They observed quietly, waiting for evidence that would confirm or deny their skepticism. As days passed without incident, the absence of anticipated harm began to exert its own pressure. People were forced to confront the gap between expectation and reality. This confrontation was not comfortable. It challenged the psychological structures that had allowed them to endure previous suffering. If pain was no longer guaranteed, then the emotional armor built to withstand it might no longer be necessary. Letting go of that armor felt dangerous, almost irresponsible. The shelter, once defined by shared dread, became a space of moral ambiguity. The clear lines drawn by fear blurred. The enemy, so carefully constructed in the mind as a source of inevitable cruelty, no longer fit the evidence at hand. This did not produce immediate reconciliation or forgiveness, but it introduced complexity. The war, as experienced here, became less absolute. This complexity had ripple effects. People reconsidered their assumptions not only about those now present, but about the conflict as a whole. If kindness could exist here, in this place shaped by destruction, then perhaps the war was not as morally uniform as it had seemed. This realization did not absolve the suffering endured, but it reframed it, suggesting that human choice still mattered within larger systems of violence. Emotionally, this was a fragile transition. Trust, once broken, does not return easily. The shelter's occupants moved carefully, testing boundaries, allowing themselves brief moments of relief before retreating into caution. Kindness, when received, was often met with silence rather than acknowledgement, not out of ingratitude, but out of fear that responding too openly might expose vulnerability. The British restraint also altered how authority itself was perceived. Power, when exercised without cruelty, challenged the assumption that dominance required dehumanization. This challenged deeply ingrained beliefs formed through prolonged exposure to violence. It suggested that control could coexist with restraint, that order did not inevitably demand suffering. This idea, radical in its simplicity, unsettled many who had learned to equate authority with threat. As the shelter adapted to this new emotional reality, the expectation of pain did not vanish, but it loosened its grip. It became one possibility among others rather than the defining certainty. This shift was subtle but significant. It allowed for moments of genuine rest, however brief. It permitted the mind to imagine outcomes that did not end in harm, even if those imaginings were quickly reined in. The most profound change, however, occurred internally. People began to reassess themselves. They noticed how deeply fear had shaped their reactions, how readily they had accepted suffering as inevitable. The presence of unexpected kindness served as a mirror, reflecting not only external behavior but internal resignation. It forced a quiet reckoning with what had been surrendered psychologically in the name of survival. This reckoning was not dramatic or immediate. It unfolded slowly, unevenly, marked by hesitation and doubt. Yet it represented a turning point. The shelter was no longer solely a place of waiting for pain. It had become a space where assumptions were questioned, where moral certainty fractured just enough to allow something new to emerge. By the end of this phase, the quiet British kindness had accomplished something profound without drawing attention to itself. It had interrupted the emotional momentum of fear. It had introduced the possibility that even within the machinery of war, individual actions could alter lived reality. The shelter remained underground, the war still raged above, but inside, the internal landscape had shifted. Expectation, once dominated by pain, now carried uncertainty of a different kind, the uncertain, fragile presence of humanity where none had been expected. The change did not announce itself with relief or celebration. Instead, it introduced a tension that was quieter but no less demanding than fear had been. As restraint and kindness persisted, the shelter entered an unfamiliar moral terrain. The certainty that had once governed emotional responses, expect pain, prepare to endure, no longer functioned as reliably. In its place emerged a state of careful evaluation, a constant weighing of intention against outcome. People found themselves alert in a new way, not bracing for violence, but monitoring meaning. Kindness, when it is unexpected, does not immediately comfort. It unsettles. For those who had survived by assuming the worst, mercy felt destabilizing. It removed the clarity that fear had provided. Under threat, reactions had been simple: hide, endure, comply, survive. Now, with cruelty withheld, choices expanded, and with them came responsibility. People had to decide how to respond, whether to acknowledge what was happening, whether to allow it to matter. This created an emotional strain that moved through the shelter unevenly. Some individuals leaned cautiously into the change, allowing themselves moments of tentative trust. Others recoiled, interpreting kindness as a test rather than a gift. The absence of immediate harm forced everyone to confront their own internal boundaries. How much vulnerability was safe? How much skepticism was still necessary? These questions had no shared answers, only personal thresholds shaped by past wounds. The shelter itself seemed altered by this moral ambiguity. Where it had once felt purely defensive, a place to endure violence from above, it now became a space of ethical tension. People noticed details they had previously ignored: the tone of instructions, the pacing of movements, the small courtesies embedded in routine actions. These details accumulated, creating a pattern that resisted simple interpretation. They suggested intention, but intention in war was notoriously difficult to trust. Trust, when it began to surface, did so quietly and unevenly. It appeared in the willingness to make eye contact, to accept assistance without flinching, to sleep slightly more deeply than before. These were not declarations of confidence, but physiological responses to reduced threat. The body, often more honest than the mind, responded first. Shoulders dropped incrementally. Breathing slowed. The constant readiness to react softened, though it never fully disappeared. Emotionally, this shift exposed a deeper vulnerability. Fear had served as a shield, a way to maintain distance from others and from one's own feelings. With that shield weakened, suppressed grief and exhaustion began to surface. Some people experienced sudden waves of sadness or anger, emotions that had been postponed by the demands of survival. The shelter absorbed these reactions silently, its walls witnessing not just endurance, but release. The moral reversal taking place was subtle but profound. Authority, once synonymous with threat, was now associated with restraint. This challenged long-held assumptions about power. People had learned that those in control inflicted suffering because they could. Now they were confronted with evidence that control could also mean choosing not to harm. This did not erase the violence of the broader war, but it complicated its moral landscape in a way that could not be ignored. For many, this complication was deeply uncomfortable. Moral clarity, even when grim, had offered a sense of orientation. Knowing who to fear and why had made the world legible, if brutal. The introduction of kindness blurred those lines, forcing people to navigate uncertainty without the familiar compass of expectation. This ambiguity required emotional labor at a time when reserves were already depleted. The shelter's collective identity also began to shift. Previously bound together primarily by shared fear, the occupants now faced the challenge of defining themselves beyond victimhood. They were no longer only people waiting to be harmed. They were witnesses to an alternative way of exercising power. This realization did not grant agency in the conventional sense, but it altered self-perception. Endurance was no longer the sole measure of strength. Interactions among the occupants reflected this transformation. There was more conversation, though still restrained, and a cautious reemergence of humor, fleeting and subdued. These moments did not negate the surrounding danger, but they introduced contrast. Laughter, when it occurred, felt almost transgressive, as if joy itself required justification. Yet it persisted, a quiet assertion that humanity had not been entirely erased. Children continued to adapt more readily, their responses offering both hope and unease. They accepted kindness with less analysis, responding to tone and behavior rather than historical expectation. Their openness highlighted the weight carried by the adults, whose caution was shaped by memory and loss. Watching children adjust reminded the older occupants of how much had been learned through pain and how difficult it was to unlearn. The British restraint also imposed a mirror on the shelter's inhabitants, reflecting their own moral compromises. In surviving the war thus far, many had made difficult choices that blurred ethical boundaries in the name of necessity. The presence of kindness without immediate cost raised uncomfortable questions about those compromises. Were they always unavoidable, or had fear narrowed perception too aggressively? These questions lingered, unspoken but persistent. This internal reckoning did not lead to condemnation or absolution. Instead, it produced a sober awareness of how context shapes behavior. The shelter became a place not just of physical refuge, but of ethical reflection. People considered how easily circumstances could dictate actions, and how rare it was to encounter restraint in a system designed for destruction. This awareness deepened empathy, even as it complicated judgment. The war outside continued unchanged, its violence indifferent to the moral shifts occurring underground. Bombardment still echoed, reminding everyone that the larger structure of conflict remained intact. This contrast sharpened the significance of what was happening inside the shelter. Kindness did not stop the war, but it disrupted its emotional monopoly. It demonstrated that even within an overwhelming system, individual conduct could diverge from expectation. As this realization settled, the expectation of pain transformed rather than disappeared. Pain was no longer assumed to be the immediate outcome of every interaction, but it was still recognized as a constant presence in the broader context. This recalibration allowed for a more nuanced emotional stance, one that acknowledged danger without surrendering entirely to it. The shelter's occupants learned to hold fear and openness simultaneously, a difficult balance that required continuous adjustment. This balance was fragile. At any moment, a single act of cruelty could have shattered it, confirming every prior assumption. That it held, even temporarily, was itself significant. It suggested that moral reversals, while rare, were possible, and that their impact extended beyond immediate circumstances. They reshaped memory, expectation, and self-understanding in ways that outlasted the moment. By this stage, the shelter was no longer defined solely by anticipation of suffering. It had become a space of moral tension, where restraint challenged resignation and kindness disrupted fear. The people within were still vulnerable, still cautious, but no longer entirely enclosed by despair. They were navigating an uncertain emotional terrain, shaped not by certainty of pain, but by the unsettling realization that humanity could persist quietly even where it had been least expected. As the days accumulated, the shelter's atmosphere carried a different weight than before. The fear had not vanished, but it had been recontextualized, no longer the sole force shaping perception. In its place emerged a layered emotional reality in which memory, gratitude, guilt, and relief coexisted uneasily. People began to realize that what was happening inside the shelter would not remain confined to that moment. It was already embedding itself into how they would remember the war, altering the narrative they would carry forward long after the ground above them settled. Pain, once anticipated as an imminent certainty, became something more reflective. It was still present in aching bodies, in exhaustion etched into faces, in the grief that surfaced during quiet moments. But it was no longer the defining endpoint of every expectation. Instead, pain became one element in a broader emotional landscape, one that now included moments of reprieve and human connection. This shift did not diminish suffering, it complicated it, forcing people to integrate kindness into experiences they had previously understood only through loss. Memory began to reorganize itself almost imperceptibly. Earlier moments of terror were still vivid, but they were now juxtaposed with instances of restraint and care. This contrast made both sharper. The kindness experience did not erase the cruelty remembered. Rather, it highlighted it, revealing how unnecessary some suffering might have been. This realization carried a quiet sting. It suggested that the war's brutality was not always an inevitability of circumstance, but often a consequence of choice. Gratitude emerged cautiously, tempered by suspicion and exhaustion. Many struggled with it, unsure how to feel thankful in a context defined by widespread destruction. To acknowledge kindness felt, at times, like a betrayal of those who had not been spared. Survivors carried an awareness of imbalance, an understanding that mercy had reached them while others endured unimaginable harm. This awareness produced a subdued, almost guilty form of relief, one that resisted expression. The shelter's occupants found themselves measuring their responses carefully. Accepting help without shame required a reevaluation of pride and survival. In the war's earlier phases, dependence had often been weaponized, used to humiliate or control. Now, assistance arrived without overt cost, challenging assumptions about power dynamics. People hesitated before accepting it, then hesitated again before expressing appreciation, uncertain which response was safer. These internal negotiations unfolded alongside subtle behavioral changes. People began to care more deliberately for one another, not out of desperation, but out of recognition. Shared experiences of fear had bonded them, but shared experiences of kindness deepened those bonds in a different way. Acts of support became more intentional. Someone saved a portion of food not out of fear, but to offer it to another. Someone stayed awake to comfort a restless child, not because they had to, but because they could. This emerging solidarity carried emotional consequences. It reminded people of the social fabric that war had torn apart, and of how fragile yet resilient that fabric could be. In recognizing each other's humanity, they also confronted the magnitude of what had been lost outside the shelter. Entire communities, families, and ways of life had been erased or scattered. The shelter, in its temporary cohesion, became both a refuge and a reminder of absence. Time, which had once felt suspended in anxiety, began to move differently. Days were still marked by uncertainty, but they no longer blurred entirely into one another. Small routines regained meaning. The distribution of supplies, the shared cleaning of space, the quiet moments of conversation became anchors. These routines did not signify normalcy, but they suggested continuity, a sense that life, even in reduced form, persisted. The kindness that had entered quietly now revealed its longer-term impact. It reshaped how people interpreted authority, nationality, and the concept of the enemy. Simplistic narratives fractured under the weight of lived experience. People understood that this did not negate the violence inflicted elsewhere, but it complicated moral judgments. The war could no longer be reduced entirely to faceless hostility. It had acquired faces capable of restraint. This complication extended inward. People reconsidered their own capacity for cruelty and compassion. They reflected on moments when fear had driven them to indifference or harshness. The presence of kindness served as a reference point, prompting uncomfortable self-examination. It raised questions about how they might act in positions of power should circumstances ever reverse. These questions lingered, shaping identity in subtle but lasting ways. Children, again, played a quiet role in this transformation. Their ability to adapt, to accept care without suspicion, highlighted the cost of prolonged fear on adult perception. Watching them respond to kindness without calculation was both heartening and painful. It underscored how much emotional labor adults had been forced to undertake simply to survive. It also hinted at the possibility of rebuilding, of a future not entirely defined by trauma. The shelter's collective memory began to take form even before the experience ended. People spoke less about what they feared would happen and more about what had already occurred. Stories were shared in fragments, not yet polished into narratives, but already shaping interpretation. These early retellings emphasized contrast, the darkness before, the quiet shift, the unexpected humanity. In doing so, they preserved the moral reversal as a central element rather than a footnote. This preservation mattered. It ensured that kindness would not be dismissed as an anomaly or forgotten amid larger tragedies. It gave the experience weight, transforming it from a fleeting relief into a meaningful event. People understood, instinctively, that how they remembered this moment would influence how they understood the war as a whole. Memory became an act of responsibility, a way to honor complexity rather than succumb to simplification. At the same time, the future remained uncertain. No one assumed that mercy would extend indefinitely or that safety was guaranteed. The war's volatility was ever-present, audible in distant sounds and felt in the shelter's thin barriers. This awareness tempered optimism, keeping expectations grounded. Hope existed, but it was cautious, informed by loss rather than innocence. The emotional maturity forced by these conditions was striking. People learned to hold conflicting truths simultaneously: gratitude without celebration, relief without forgetting, trust without naivety. This balancing act demanded resilience of a different kind than mere endurance. It required reflection, empathy, and restraint, qualities that war often erodes but had, in this instance, unexpectedly reinforced. As the shelter's experience drew toward transition, whether through movement, release, or continuation under new conditions, its imprint was undeniable. People sensed that they would not leave unchanged. The expectation of pain, once central to survival, had been challenged and redefined. In its place stood a more nuanced understanding of suffering and humanity, one that acknowledged cruelty without surrendering entirely to it. What endured most was not the absence of violence, but the presence of choice. The realization that individuals could act with restraint within a system built for destruction altered how people understood responsibility. It suggested that even when circumstances were overwhelming, agency, however limited, still mattered. This insight would accompany them beyond the shelter, shaping how they navigated the war's aftermath and remembered its meaning. In this way, the shelter became more than a physical refuge. It became a site of moral education, where lived experience challenged inherited narratives and reshaped emotional expectations. The kindness encountered there did not solve the war's injustices, but it reframed suffering, introducing a countercurrent that flowed quietly but persistently against the tide of destruction. That countercurrent, once felt, could not be entirely forgotten.